Wait, so we're not in mid-sentence when the green light comes on. There it is. I did want to tell you, you all have, I hope, all of you who have done your websites now have a grade. The maximum points I gave were 40, and I really have to tell you thank you. Some of your sites were just stunning. I had this whole crisis, identity crisis, as I was looking at some of them, because what am I doing if you're teaching? I mean, you all can teach yourselves better, and there's all this material on the web, and so maybe I'll retire. It was such a success. But anyway, if you have questions, kind of a relative scale, I looked at content, I looked at complexity, I looked at beauty, and so I hope that your grade more or less satisfies you. I would say 36 to 40 is an A, and 36 to 33 is a B, or 32, and mostly the grades were there if you did the assignment as you were supposed to do it. So thank you. I have constructed the part of your final which will require you to study all of the websites in the class. I've taken little details out of them as I was reading them. Thank you, ma'am. And so that'll be kind of a, as I say, scavenger hunt. I didn't take utterly obscure things. I just want you to appreciate each other's work and learn from it. So I'll give that to you on the 2nd of December as planned. Now, I had asked you to bring your ceremony, your book, with you. It seems there's always so much more to say than we say about any of the books. But I guess what I wanted to do is utter the word post-colonial and talk just a minute about that. Both of the novels we've seen are very self-consciously post-colonial. Now this is funny because both are North American novels, that is U.S. novels, that we don't think about, and we don't think about the U.S. as a colonized country. But indigenous populations were definitely colonized by the English, the French, the Spanish, and others. And so the post-colonial perspective, that is the perspective of formerly and perhaps even currently colonized people, is something that both Erdrich and Silko are, I think, exceptionally good at. I notice a number of you are going to write your papers on either one or both of those novels, and I'm glad to hear that because I think there's so much to be said. If you do decide to write on that topic, or on a topic that looks at colonized peoples, that is the ways in which, the kingdom of this world, T. Noel is a colonized person. He has a culture which happens to be African rather than indigenous, that then has an overlay, an imposed overlay of European culture. And when you stop to think about it, most of the world is in this situation. What parts of the world did Europe not colonize? Japan, China, Indonesia, maybe. But think of India, and India has a great magical realist, or several, Salman Rushdie. Nigeria, I'm thinking of Ben Okri, whose novel The Famished Road is thick like this. I don't tend to teach it, but it's very, very beautiful. The Nigerian experience of, let me say, the Nigerian post-colonial experience. Why is magical realism preferred, or at least used in these areas? Because it's so good at expressing contradiction. Two or more things can be true at once, and they can be contradictory at once. It's also because the magic or the spirituality, the animism, is allowed to surface in ways that it isn't in the realistic novel. So all of the things that we've already said, but if you're interested in writing on this aspect, this socio-political aspect of whatever novel you choose or novels you choose to write about, if you look at Stephen Slemmon's article in our anthology, I would recommend it. He happens to be talking about two Canadian, English language Canadian novels that are magical realist novels, and that he argues are post-colonial novels in the sense that they're aware of their dual or multiple cultural status. So, and he starts out very interestingly by saying, watch out, we who study magical realism, it maybe gives us too much of an excuse to look at colonized cultures as if we knew something about them. And I've freely admitted to you that I'm not an expert in either Mountain Chippewa culture or Laguna Pueblo culture, we feel as if we approach it somewhat in these novels. He says, well, be careful of that, because it can be a way of just sort of saying, well, everything is magical, real, and isn't that wonderful? And a novel from India is the same as one from Colombia. And, well, we do a bit of that, I suppose, in this class, in part because we're moving quickly over a lot of American territory. But anyway, I recommend Slayman to you. I was rereading his very brilliant, I think, essay over the weekend. And, you know, you may not be interested in all he has to say about these two Canadian novels, which I haven't read. I've only heard about them because I've read Stephen Slayman, but they're rather known among those who know Canadian literature, which isn't me. But anyway, I recommend that essay to you if you're thinking about dealing with magical realism as a post-colonial mode. And it's almost impossible not to in this course, because we're reading post-colonial works, that is, by writers who are aware of their formerly colonized status and the cultural displacements involved in European colonization, whether Africa, Latin America, etc. So, and you know, some more than others. The House of the Spirits, which we do have to get onto, is less aware of it's another agenda. Isabel Allende has a very political agenda, as we know, but it's to critique and explain the 1973 coup in Chile, even though she doesn't ever utter the word Chile. So that was just a little preface to my desire for you all to think about magical realism as a particular tool for particular kinds of writers, just as the epic poem was a particular tool for the Greeks and the Romans, and the sonnet for, well, for the Renaissance on. But every genre is a tool for a culture to express itself. The novel comes up in the 18th century for reasons I can tell you about the 18th century. The rise of the individual, the rise of capitalism, all that stuff that's described in novels suddenly means something. It's the rise of bourgeois culture. The novel didn't really exist before that. Narrative did, storytelling did, but not the novel as such. So think about the rise of magical realism in the past, let's say 40 years. Well, let's date it since 1949, so that's more than 40 with the Kingdom of This World. In Latin America, writers are finding this useful for their cultural and political and social, as well as their artistic purposes. So anyway, that's just a little by the way. You know, I think we'd better get on, even though I see you brought your, have you brought both books, or have you just brought Ceremony? Some of you brought one, some of you another. Have you gotten into Isabel Allende yet? A bit? Well, let me say it this way. Are there things that you want to raise about Ceremony that we just ignored, which is a great deal, no doubt? Would you like to look at certain passages that we haven't looked at? Shall we finish it up in some way that we haven't? I think we said we were going to look at the very end of the novel, so let's go there and spend 5 or 10 minutes. I feel it now. Time's winged chariot passing by or hurrying by from Andrew Marvell. I just misquoted the line, so don't pay any attention. We were about at 2:43, and I had showed you where there's the moment when people start listening to him. It's a little later than that. Let me see if I can find it. They're asking him about the experience we have just read about. Let's see. Does anybody have that page? Top of one of the right-hand page. Let's see. It's 257. Thank you. Yeah, it's closer to the end than I remembered. 257. This is where I think we understand that Tayo has now become the storyteller. And as I said, the value on the interpolated narratives, the reason they're not set in type like the novel, the rest of the novel, is because Silko wants us to know that these are told tales, that they're oral narratives. Someone opined, oh, and I have your quizzes, by the way, someone opined in his quiz that these were taken from another text. I don't think so. I think Silko has invented them, but based in traditional ways of narration. And we talked a bit about the Kachina and the trickster figure and so forth. So figure that they replicate traditional oral narratives, but in an original way. But they're meant to say something about the oral culture. And so that's why I think it's so important to recognize that there is this shift. I think it's very subtly put, and since it comes at the top of page 257, we don't even see that white typographic break that is, I feel certain, intended to be there. It took a long time to tell them the story of his journey, right? They stopped him frequently with questions about the location and the time of day. They asked about the direction she had come from and the color of her eyes, that very distinctive detail that we've mentioned. It was while he was sitting there facing southeast, important, facing southeast. We don't know why. I don't know what in the culture makes southeast important. Maybe some of you will do that kind of research. It's certainly important. That he noticed how the four windows and so forth. We read that, and we read the interpolated passage. But here what we have is the tribe, the group, listening to Tayo. And we go, this goes through page 258. We still see them sitting there. When the sun was dropping near the center of the west window, they stood up. That's the first full paragraph. They were going home to rest and eat supper. They would be back after dark. Old man Kush told him they could have water but no food. He was not to leave the kiva. He could have water, but not food. You see, he's become himself the center of the spiritual activity. Kush showed him an old enamel chamber pot. We saw that. He said to drink from the water, cupping it in his hands. They unraveled the dead skin coyote threw on him. They cut it up bundle by bundle. Every evil which entangled him was cut to pieces. Whew, that's a good thing, isn't it? Then they found Harley. We go back to the real world outside the kiva, outside the storytelling moment, and then look, if we come back, look at page 260, and we'll look at the very end of the novel. Privilege is given to the poetic, let's say the oral narrative, both to begin and end the novel. The first word and the final word is the indigenous oral cultural context, right? Look at the last full paragraph on 260. Old Grandma shook her head slowly and closed her cloudy eyes again. I guess I must be getting old, she said, because these goings-on around Laguna don't get me excited anymore. She sighed and laid her head back on the chair. It seems like I already heard these stories before. Only thing is, the names sound different. And then the poetic interpolation. Whirling darkness started its journey with its witchery, and its witchery had returned upon it. Its witchery had returned into its belly. Its own witchery had returned all around it. Whirling darkness had come back on itself. It kept all its witchery to itself. It doesn't open its eyes with its witchery. It has stiffened with the effects of its own witchery. It is dead for now. 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 And then we turn the page and we have this beautiful moment in the middle of the page. Sunrise, accept this offering, sunrise. So it feels very much, and some of you in your quizzes when I asked you to compare and contrast, and maybe that would be something that I'd like to hear from you about, when I asked you to compare and contrast tracts and ceremony, some of you talked about the way the novels end. Who did that? Remember who talked about comparing and contrasting the ends of tracts and ceremony? Do you remember your quiz? Did you do that, Ruth? What did you have to say about that? I found it very interesting.
Well, I remember what I said about it was that while ceremony ended with a string of hope, there was some sense of Teo's accomplishment. Tracks just sort of ended, and there was this desperation, and it's. Yeah. This is really for all those murders that occur, and
horrible goings-on, as the grandmother says, at the very end of the novel, it has a much more affirmative feel. Tell us how the very, very end of Tracks, remember how that goes?
Yeah, I mean, there's just this separation of the characters.
Yeah.
And, you know, just this general separation of the characters, which sort of represent this sort of maybe spreading out of the tribe even more, and, you know, dislocating of these people that were once joined together.
Yeah, the dispersal.
Right.
There is that tiny little moment of, let's say, a temporary triumph, because Nanapush gets Lulu back from the school for himself. So there is that tiny movement of coming together, but the main movement of the characters is to disperse. We don't even know where the central character is. She seems she's rather disappeared. So it is interesting that, you know, we can speak of affirmative and not affirmative, and maybe that's too simple, but I mean, I think both are brilliant novels in their different ways. But I found that was interesting. What else did y'all have to say, or do you have to say about Tracks and Ceremony? Chris, are you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's I don't know if we said it already, but there's definitely more of a dynamic feature to the characters in Tracks, because it's more psychological, and Ceremony seems to be more mythological, because half the text takes place in a mythological world.
Yeah.
You know, and then also at the endings of the two novels, it just made me think that Ceremony ends on more of an optimism, where you don't have something that's been mentioned in the story that's ongoing, that's going to inevitably bring something to a close to the direct characters. Where in the end of Tracks, you know, the land's being torn down at the same moment that that Nanapush is reunited with Flora's daughter.
Right. Yeah, I like that word, inevitability. There is something about, you know, have you studied Greek tragedy or even Shakespearean tragedy? Part of what the rules for tragedy is that the hero knows his own fate, but he confronts it anyway. I mean, Prometheus bound is always the example given. He's going to give fire to man, and he knows he'll be punished in that particular way in which he's punished, which is chained to a rock, etc. He knows this before he does it, but that's what makes him heroic. He's not just somebody stupid who gets punished for doing something he didn't know had consequences. And there's something, so it's an inevitability. There's an inevitability about tragedy, that fate, that destiny has taken over. You do feel that, I think, in Tracks, whereas you don't at all. I don't in Ceremony. We watch this person take hold of his life, quite the opposite of being washed downstream, as you feel the characters are in Tracks. Yeah, Anne, were you going to say something?
Is my light on? The one difference I noticed was the magic worked differently in each novel. In Tracks, Fleur's magic left her, and we were shown the trees were cut before they all fell so dramatically.
Yeah.
And in Ceremony, Tayo is saved with magic.
Yeah, very nice. Now, thank you very much. That's right. That's a very interesting point. I remember you made it on your quiz. Yeah, very nice point. Because the magic is rather, it's so inherent in the landscape in Tracks, isn't it? You know, the nature itself is animate, whether it's the lake or whatever, especially the lake. But it's not there at the service of people. Whereas here, clearly, the medicine man, the journey, this woman spirit who is both is so real. We didn't look at the lovemaking scene, but there's certainly an erotic side, as you know, as well as a spiritual side to this female figure. So, yeah, thank you. That's a very, very interesting point. They're both magical, but in one case the magic serves the characters and the other not. That's a good point. Other comparison contrasts that you want to think about there? I mean, we didn't do much with Chris's point that one is you know, when I first read Ceremony, except for the interpolations, I said, well, you know, this is really kind of a standard realistic narration. I mean, even when he's on his journey for the spotted cattle, there's so much specificity. You know, that that's what we talked about. Were the cattle real or not? And in the end, they are. We see them in the corral. But I've changed my mind a bit about this novel because, as Chris points out, half of it is a kind of psychological, spiritual journey, as realistically as it's recounted. So, yeah. Anyway, we can talk about that, or maybe some of you will talk about that in your papers. Other comments you have on the comparative questions here? Richard, you must have something to say on this. I know you do. Or did you? You were looking so tired there, Richard. I had to call on you. You weren't asleep, but not at all. Any comments? You don't have to comment if you don't want.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Last chance for this one. And there's so much more to be said. Some of you will say it in your papers. If you decide to write on either of these papers, and Kathy, I brought you a copy of that Nancy Peterson essay. I don't know if you saw that I answered your email. Come up after class, I have that essay for you. Because make sure to look into the history and the nature of these tribal cultures, these tribal groups, if you write on either of these novels. Because the Nancy Peterson one?
I don't know who the name is.
Okay, you have it?
I have the article on it.
Okay, great. Well, would you two confer? And if it's the same one that I have, then yeah, thank you. Because part of it is, of course, looking at the novel, but part of it is considering what magical realism is and to what ends it's put. Because inevitably you're going to end up talking about this subgenre that we've talked about endlessly all semester long. Okay, Isabel Allende. Isabel Allende is alive and well and living in California. She married apparently a person in California about, well, I don't know how long ago, quite a number of years ago. But as you know, or maybe you don't, she was born in Chile, left not immediately after the coup. Actually, I thought she would leave the night of the coup, since the president with the capital P in question in the novel is her uncle, Isabel Allende's uncle, Salvador Allende. She left shortly thereafter, went to Venezuela, was a journalist in Venezuela, and began writing, this is her first novel, began writing The House of the Spirits because she wanted to say something about her fury at being exiled from her own country and her fury at the military dictatorship who murdered the duly elected president of a 100-year democratic regime. How could this happen? How is it possible that the military is so bad? Do if you decide to write about this novel, which I know it's late in the semester, do look up Augusto Pinochet, Pinochet. He was the head of the Argentine state from 1973 for about 10 years, it strikes me. I have to look up some of the specifics myself. He was a military. He's still alive. He is under house arrest. Finally, Chile is getting around, through the help of Spain, it's a complicated legal matter, to trying some of the people who are guilty for many, many murders during the military regime. Let me just say a word about that military regime. In the southern cone of Latin America, there were 4 military dictatorships, starting in 1964 in Brazil. Brazil isn't exactly the southern cone, but 1964 the military took over there. Then in 73 in Chile, 73 also in Uruguay, and in Argentina in 1976. In all of those countries, there were disastrous repressions of civil rights of citizens, and particularly of those citizens who would play the role of intellectuals, students, faculty members, universities, newspapers, the institutions that one expects to, obviously church parishes, in some cases parliaments were suspended. Why was this, what was this trend in the southern cone of South America? All of those countries have strong military traditions. To become a high-ranking military officer in those countries was a very highly regarded social and political status. It's not like the U.S., where now with our army, unfortunately, it's sometimes the reverse. The people who go into the military have few other options. Not always, of course, but there was a long tradition of a strong military, well-educated, a military elite, let's say. So there was already waiting in the wings a well-organized and intelligent army. The reason for this large army in these countries had been justified always on the idea of an external threat to the country. Things started to change in the 60s, the late 60s and 70s. They did here too, in a way. Luckily, we escaped this fate. But there's a general economic crisis, a series of leftist insurgencies, and a countervailing series of government repressions throughout Latin America. So there's a kind of reactionary response. We see it all in this novel. If you've gotten this far, you'll recognize it. Allende does a great job of saying how the storm brewed and brewed. So there are people wishing to speak out against the system. They're repressed by the government. So a reactionary response, which was centered in the militaries of the various countries. Military response to student uprisings, to, let's say, leftist organizations who weren't happy with things. There evolved something called the Doctrine of National Security. This doctrine, which was first promulgated, I'm looking at my notes here, first promulgated most elaborately by the Brazilian generals who brought down their own country's populist democratic regime in 1964, held that the principal threat was no longer external but internal. And that the armies needed to start looking at, the subversive elements inside the country. And this, of course, under the banner of anti-communism. This big threat is a world communist movement, but there are internal subversive actions, and we have to start looking at those. So this idea of sedition, which probably was partially true. Salvador Allende was a member of the Communist Party. He was elected to office. He didn't take office. So, long story short, this idea of these countries hopelessly infected with communist tendencies, and only the region's military institutions, pure and untainted, were in a position to respond to the threat. Therefore, paradoxically, the situation could easily occur in which only a military coup and a subsequent dictatorial military rule could save democracy. That was always the justification. This is temporary. This is temporary, state of war. Why? We're going to preserve democracy. So the very people who have overthrown the democratic regimes are arguing that this is what's necessary to save democracy. So these anti-communist values turn ugly, and we see, as we see in the novel, more and more there's this polarization between the left and the right until there's a huge vacuum in the middle, and bang, the military comes in and takes over. And so I think I've mentioned two movies about this period that you must see. One is called Missing, not the recent version. There's some movie called Missing, but this is with Jack Lemmon, made in, I suppose, the 80s. And it's about Chile. It's about an American man whose son, American student, had the bad luck to be in Chile when the coup occurred, and he disappeared. The disappeared well, you know it from the novel, or you will know it, was a huge thing. People would be taken away and never heard from again. So the Jack Lemmon movie I super recommend, and another one about Argentina called The Official Story or The Official Version. It came out under 2 titles, one in England and one here, about the wife of an Argentine military higher-up who is very much shielded from all the dirty tricks that are going on, and her increasing awareness that something is wrong, and a very beautiful and very horribly tragic movie. But I recommend it very much because it gives you a sense, at least, of this period and the ways in which a culture can turn on itself. Even a man and a wife can be so far apart on the reality. That's why it's called The Official Story. There's an official story, and then there's another one, and that's the one that she spends the movie learning about, to her horror. Okay, so having said that about the political background, already we have a difference between Garcia Marquez and Isabel Allende, who are inevitably and always compared. We don't have to really start 100 Years of Solitude by understanding a particular political moment in Colombia. By the way, Colombia is spelled with an O. A couple of you on your websites, it's C-O-L-O-M, Colombia, O-M-B-I-A. We have Columbia University. Columbia is the Columbian exhibition in Chicago in whenever it was, the turn of the 19th century. But the country happens to be spelled with an O. So if you've done that on your website, and a couple of you did it more than once, would you, if you have time, correct that? We don't want the world reading our websites with that misspelled. There were a few details on some of yours, but it just seems silly at this point in the semester to give you very specific comments. But that is one I would like you to check on if you've used the word Colombia and spelled it that way. Okay, Garcia Marquez comes up right in your face at the beginning of this novel with some of the very same details that we've already seen. Plus we have, we had Remedios the Beauty, and here we have Rosa the Beauty. She says that she began writing this novel, as I said, it was her first, without knowing she was writing a novel. She was just putting things down. And I think what she was doing was being inspired by Garcia Marquez. The coincidences are too great not to notice. In fact, some people quit reading the novel and just say, look, this is derivative. I feel I've already read it. I've read 100 Years of Solitude, and that's enough for me. I think as you read on, you'll see that it becomes very much its own novel. I think it's my own preference is I prefer it to 100 Years of Solitude, because it becomes more and more realistic and more trenchantly political, until we can't not shed real salt tears on the printed page when we realize that the catastrophe that is this military coup, this terrible scenes with Alba. If you haven't gotten there, I won't tell you. And really the tragedy of a family where, again, the wife and the husband see things utterly differently. It becomes much more, for me, a much more powerful political novel, and I happen to like powerful political novels. I also think it's just beautifully written, and I like it that the axis of spirituality / magic is female, whereas I don't feel that to be the case in 100 Years of Solitude, even though we have Ursula there as kind of an anchor for the family. But anyway, some of you have proposed to compare these two novels, and there is an article I'll get to you if you're going to do that, which does it very minutely, so you can cite that article and go on to other kinds of comparisons. But what I want to do today, and I may hand out, I think I will, our teaching evaluations at 12:30. So what I'd like to do is start walking through some passages, unless you want to start someplace in particular. Interrupt me, I'm doing all the talking. Just to look at the nature of the magical realism that we have here. Obviously, we're going to see it largely at the outset, but let's just do some pages here, and some very beautiful writing, beautifully translated, in my view. It reads as if it were written in English, which is how you judge a translation. You don't judge it by comparing. I mean, if you can do Spanish and English, you compare them and see what was done, but we should be able to judge a translation from the Russian, from the Japanese, from the whatever, even if we don't speak it, by saying how fluent is it in English and how effective is the prose. Let's start on, I'm going to do double pages. Does anybody have the hardcover besides me, or everybody's got the soft cover? Oh, goody. I'll just tell you soft cover pages and I'll go to the hardcover. Okay, would you go to your page 4, please? It's at the bottom of 4. Just this beautiful description of Rosa. It's in the middle. She has very long paragraphs, as you will have noticed, and it's in the middle of, it's the bottom of your page, but in the middle of a long paragraph. Do you see the sentence begins, on the contrary, at 18, Rosa was still slender? Everybody got it? And remained unblemished. Her maritime grace had, if anything, increased. The tone of her skin with its soft bluish lights, and of her hair, as well as her slow movements and silent character, all made one think of some inhabitant from the sea. See, well, let's keep going. There was something of the fish to her. If she had had a scaly tail, she would have been a mermaid. But her 2 legs placed her squarely on the tenuous line between a human being and a creature of myth. That to me, remember when we first were talking about magical realism in this class, and I pointed to one sentence in Garcia Marquez's The Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, and said the people never knew whether he was an angel or a man because he refused all food and in the end ate only eggplant mush. That's a perfect definition of magical realism. The undecidability of the kind of thing this is. That's the ontological question. What's the nature of reality? That's the question posed. And this does the same thing with that half sentence, which is so beautifully. But her 2 legs were placed squarely on the tenuous line between a human being and a creature of myth. How do you place something squarely on a tenuous line? You said she's playing with us here. And furthermore, then that idea of the possibility of both selves, both creatures at once. So I love that. I'm going to show you some slides of a Mexican surrealist painter, Remedios Varo, next time, and I'm going to cite this passage again because Varo has one painting that looks like this. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the sea. It seems that Barabbas is the criminal who was released instead of Jesus from Pontius Pilate, and then at the same time, this person here, Rosa, who is such a mythological creature, where it makes me want to think about what she's embroidering and perhaps like indigenous tapestry in Chile.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, she's of the sea, which makes me think that by sea, conquistadors bringing religion. I don't know the meaning of sea.
Yeah. Well, of course, when we think of Chile, the whole country has an enormous, everyone is by the sea in Chile because it runs practically, it's a very skinny country, as you know, on the Pacific coast of South America. I think maybe here you're overreading or tending to overread. It's hard to know what we should interpret and how much in any novel. What I like to say is when we come up to that question, everything is meaningful. You have to assume that we can interpret everything. But I think perhaps here early on, what she's doing is making us enter into a kind of magical world of women. I actually heard her talk about the name Barabbas. She was here at Rice University years ago, and I was chatting with her, which was fun. And but she's very anti-academic, which wasn't so fun. She basically said, I have received 100,000 letters about the meaning of the name of that, the symbolic importance of the dog and of his name. And she says, I just put that dog in there, and there was a dog named that. Is a bit the Garcia Marquez thing, where he says, look, I've never written anything I haven't known or known someone who knew about. So I thought that was a little, so she basically said that's a silly question. I don't think it's a silly question. I'm in the business of interpreting literary text, and so are you, as long as you're in a literature class. So, but I guess here I want to say, let's leave that on hold. I think maybe those aren't, the question I would ask is why she takes the fall for her father. Why, you know, remember she's poisoned, and here she's this unearthly, beautiful thing. Why does Isabel Allende want to kill her off at the outset of the novel? Of course, we quickly forget about her, but it certainly has resonance for the rest of the novel because she's the intended of Esteban Trueba. Right. Yeah.
So it would be better to read the female parts as magical realism and the masculine parts as reasonable.
Well, I'm afraid that is, I'm not afraid. I think that is the way to read it. I mean, what magical realist male do we have here? One of the twins, the sons, has a tendency in that direction, as I recall, but the men are the pragmatists, and of course Esteban Trueba drowns out practically all of the other men with his intransigence, his political conservatism, his up-by-the-bootstrapsism, his sexual misbehavior, etc. So, the female principles, this is the argument I'm going to make when I show you these pictures of Remedios Varo. She paints mystical, magical women. That's her subject. And in fact, at Rice, when I was first met Isabel Allende, I was trying out this paper, which you'll hear, this inter-artistic comparison between Remedios Varo and Isabel Allende. And she was sitting there, and that was kind of fun to try out my theories on her. And at the end, I asked her, because I was, or maybe at the beginning, I asked if she'd ever seen the work of this particular artist, and she said no, but I feel that she represents my sense of things. And I appreciated that because it seems to me that Varo, not that she illustrates the novel, but her worldview is analogous to the worldview here, where you have a creature squarely placed on the tenuous line between a human being and a creature of myth. Let's keep moving to the next. We get these four names, actually, that all mean white or clear or bright, don't we? Nivea. Nieve is the word for snow, as you know in Spanish. Or we have Nivea cream. It means white or light. That's she leaves the story quickly, but that's the first generation. We have four generations: then Clara, then Blanca, then Alba, and well, I won't tell you what the end. There's another generation promised at the end. So this is about a multi-generational saga of women with particular powers. Turn to page 82, will you? You're 82. And it's my 72. Again, just it's 2/3 of the way down on page 82. This magic, again, a kind of, just to approach the kind of magical realism that this novel offers us. By the way, start on that sentence. It's a delight for me to read her notebooks from those years. That me is going to tell you again who the narrator is of the entire novel. I wondered at the very beginning, I have a note to myself, the first time I read it, we have an I at the fifth line of the novel, and I said, I think it's Esteban Trueba looking back over this history. It turns out not to be the case, that someone else is looking back over the history. But embedded in this history are first-person chapters by Esteban, so which couldn't possibly be remembered by Alba, who turns out to be the narrator. So we're asked to suspend our disbelief. But the I here is, or the me here is important because she tells us at the end, I'll say it, go ahead and say it, she tells us at the end of the novel that she has read her grandmother's notebooks. So here we're getting a little foreshadowing of what will be an important point at the end, as it is, as we remember, in 100 Years of Solitude, where we find out who narrates, and that matters for what we think of what we've been told. So it's a delight for me to read her notebooks from those years which describe a magic world that no longer exists. Clara lived in a universe of her own invention, protected from life's inclement weather, where the prosaic truth, that's the first element here. We're going to look at the AB structure, the magical real structure, where the prosaic truth of material objects mingled with the tumultuous reality of dreams. That's B. We have the prosaic truth of material objects mingled with the tumultuous reality of dreams, and the laws of physics and logic did not always apply. Clara spent this time wrapped in her fantasies, accompanied by the spirits of the air, the water, and the earth. For 9 years she was so happy that she felt no need to speak. We feel like we're reading a Grimm's fairy tale. She was so happy that everyone had lost all hope of hearing her voice again when on her birthday, after blowing out 19 candles on her chocolate cake, she tried out the voice that she had kept in storage all those years and that sounded like an untuned instrument. "I'm going to be married soon," she said. "To whom?" Severdo asked. "To Rosa's fiancé," Clara replied. Only then did they realize she had spoken for the first time in all those years. The miracle shook the house to its foundations and set the whole family weeping, and so forth. So, again, that sentence that I want you to pay attention to is that one that I've emphasized, where the prosaic truth of material objects mingled with the tumultuous reality of dreams, and the laws of physics and logic did not always apply. Okay, so we're in this world. We're told, but we forget it, that this world, by the me, that this world no longer exists. Okay, go now, will you, to page 90. It's the bottom of 90. And here again, just another passage to trace this these magical women, or these, let's say, spiritual women. Clara was a vision in white chantilly lace and natural camellias, as happy as a parrot after her 9 years of silence, dancing with her fiancé beneath the canopies and lanterns, completely oblivious, and here's what I want you to pay attention to, completely oblivious to the warnings of the spirits that gestured desperately at her from the curtains, because in the tumult and whirl she could not see them. The spirits are behind the curtains in this house. It's the house itself that is the magical territory, isn't it? And of course, these desperate warnings, it's a bit like Garcia Marquez, that kind of foreshadowing where we don't know quite what's going to be happening. Down below, about 10 lines or 8, you'll see the phrase, "the whispering spirits behind the curtains," and so you get the idea there. Now, I wanted to look at the Mora sisters. I asked you about them on your quiz because they are important here. These women get together who have a particular kind of spirituality, and they sit around and they commune. We don't know quite whether they ask, well, we do. We're told what they ask about, and they're very, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? And it's not as if it's great mythic thought, but it's meant, I think, to tell us something. And so let's look at it. You go to 125. Mark these pages down if you don't have your text with you, so you can underline them, because obviously when we get to the final, these are the passages that you'll be asked to identify, some of them anyway. Let me see, I'm on 107 and you're on 125. It's the beginning of a paragraph, and this is where we see these translucent ladies. Again, it suits this suits my purposes perfectly when you see Remedios Varo. She also has translucent ladies doing wonderful things like weaving their fate. Look at that paragraph that begins there. On one Friday afternoon, 3 translucent ladies knocked at the door to the big house on the corner. They had eyes like sea mist, covered their heads with old-fashioned flowered hats, and were bathing in the strong scent of wild violets, which infiltrated all the rooms and left the house smelling of flowers for days after their visit. They were the 3 Mora sisters. Now, I'm sure we're meant to think here of the 3 fates, right? Who in Greek are M-O-I-R-A-E. The Moiri, I don't know how to pronounce ancient Greek. I'll tell you a little bit more about them later, but let's just go ahead here and see this scene. Clara was in the garden and appeared to have been waiting for them all afternoon. She greeted them with a baby at each breast and Blanca playing at her feet. She took They looked at each other, recognized each other, smiled at each other. It was the beginning of a passionate spiritual relationship that was to last the remainder of their lives, and if their predictions had come true, must still be flourishing in the hereafter. The three Mora sisters were students of spiritualism and supernatural phenomena. And then this is so funny. She's making fun here. Thanks to a photograph that showed the three of them around a table with a misty winged ectoplasm flying overhead, which some unbelievers attributed to a stain from the developer and others to a simple photographic trick, they were the only people who possessed irrefutable proof that souls can take on physical form. Irrefutable, that's the word that is brilliant in that sentence. There's this blob above them in a photograph, and some people say it could be this, and some people say maybe it's a photographic trip, but that's irrefutable evidence. She gives us precisely that it's not irrefutable, that there are people who don't feel that this is any evidence at all, and then we're told it's irrefutable proof. Via mysterious connections available only to initiates, they learned of Clara's existence, established telepathic contact with her, and immediately realized that they were astral sisters. By way of a series of discreet inquiries, they managed to obtain her earthly address and arrived at her door with decks of cards impregnated with beneficent liquids, several sets of geometrical figures, and mysterious tools of their own invention, etc. Okay, enough of that. It keeps going and going. I love the long sentences. Look at page... I want the table. They sit at a table, and I'm going to make a point about the table because you'll see that Remedios Varo also paints a table. It's where people, spiritualists, go and sit and feel, apparently, feel the spirits. And so look at 256, will you? This three-legged table. So you're getting the idea. There's a lot of hyperbole here, overstatement, utter disregard for the probability. You know, they established telepathic communication and got her address and so forth. We're asked to accept these things as true, as we do in magical realist texts. It's the paragraph on, it's going to be your 256, it's the paragraph that starts, none of this worried Blanca very much. The only thing that had truly distressed her were the mummies. You'll get to this marvelous scene if you haven't already. But what I'm interested in here is her reference to the three-legged table. Oh yeah, it's right there at the top. She's in quite a pickle here, and you'll read about it. She has married a man whom she doesn't know at all. The only thing that truly distressed her were the mummies. She was well acquainted with the dead, having spent much of her life in contact with them by means of her mother's three-legged table. She was used to seeing their transparent silhouettes gliding down the hallways of her parents' house, making noise in the wardrobes, and appearing in people's dreams to predict calamities or lottery prizes. You see, they don't... There's a place, I maybe we'll get to about the weather. Go to 259. The point is, these spirits, they walk around the house, they're behind the curtains, but they're, you know, it's a world that's a richer world, but it's a world not that you have to appease the spirits or you ask the spirits for this or that, but they're kind of present, they're just there. On 259, again, just a reference to the three-legged table. Start this paragraph that begins, the Indian set off at a slow trot. If you haven't gotten to this part yet, and I think many of you haven't, this is the denouement. This is where Blanca realizes that she's in deep and she'd better flee, and she does. She takes her child and leaves. No, what am I saying? She doesn't have a child. She just leaves. She scurries away. Sorry about that. But there's one sentence here that I love about a chicken, and then we'll get to the three-legged table. So let's just read the whole paragraph together. The Indian set off at a slow trot typical of his race, and she remained in the house with the other servants, whom she feared far less than the strange individual with the courtly inclinations, the head servant. Since she estimated that she had a couple of hours before he returned, she decided not to be too hasty and proceed calmly. She was determined to clear up the mystery of the furtive mummies. Convinced that in daylight the mummies would be in no mood for clowning, she went to the dark room hoping that the door would be open, but it was locked as always. She tried all the keys on her ring, but none of them worked. Then she took the biggest knife from the kitchen, slipped it into the door jamb, and forced it until the dried out wood splintered and came out in fragments. Thus she managed to pry the lock loose from the frame and open the door. The damage to the door was impossible to hide, and she realized when her husband saw it, she would have to give some rational explanation, but she consoled herself with the argument that as mistress of the house, she had the right to know what was going on beneath her roof. Despite her common sense, which she had withstood more than 20 years' worth of the three-legged table and her mother's prognostications, she was trembling as she crossed the threshold of the dark room. So here, she's well acquainted with the spirits, we heard a couple pages back, but here, despite that table, and because of that table, she's had to get some common sense developed here. The chicken has eluded me. I have to find him or her. Oh yes, it's 257, 1/3 of the way from the bottom. This is also an example that I give of what's different about magical realism from realism. This is where we're still in this same situation, which you'll read about. They're having dinner, and her husband's name is Jean de Satigny, and he was rooted to his chair. Do you find that when she told him about their nightly promenades, their whispers, and their suffocated cries, that is, of the mummies, Jean de Satigny was rooted in his chair, his fork frozen in midair, and his mouth locked open. He knows that she's on to him. And then look at this sentence. The Indian who was just entering the dining room with the serving tray stumbled and the roast chicken rolled under a chair. John employed all his charm, firmness, and reason to convince her that her nerves were playing tricks on her, and it was the product of her unbridled fantasy. What becomes of that chicken? Nothing. Now, if a servant had stumbled in a realistic novel and spilled the chicken under a chair, someone would have to say, oh dear, the dinner's been ruined. Or they'd have to say, oh, well, never mind, the floor has just been mopped. Or they'd have to say, excuse me, would you move your chair while I pick up the chicken? Here, I love this, the kind of detail that is to give atmosphere, but it doesn't have to be realized realistically. If I were a novelist, I think I would go toward this in this direction, because I have friends who are novelists, and they say, oh, the terrible thing is you have to remember, you know, the characters in this room, and you have to give him or her time to get downtown, or you have to remind your reader how that character has a cup of coffee in her hand. You know, well, not in magical realism. The chicken can roll under the chair, and it's left there gathering dust as far as we know. You know what, I'm going to quit, and I'm going to ask you to fill out class evaluations. And who is going back to Roy Cullen and would be willing to administer the evaluations and